Bueno, y ahora después.
Well, after listening to the commitments from each company to tackle the methane problem, we're going to talk about climate transparency and reporting. For that, we are going to hear from progress and challenges on such matters. We would like to invite to the stage Hillmert Solano. He's from the Tachyus Corporation. We want to invite Erika Ortiz Sanchez from the Mexican Observatory of Methane Emissions, Florencia Carrera from the International Methane Emissions Observatory of UNEP. And we would like to invite once more Irene Alfaro, but this time she would be the panelist. And as a moderator, we're going to have María Alejandra Garzón, which is a technical coordinator from OEMLAC. All right. Good afternoon. Thank you for still being here with us in the upcoming 40 minutes, let's hope. The idea is to tackle everything related to transparency. And then we're going to have a coffee break, and we're going to complete the day with our regulation methane panel. When we were designing this panel, this includes climate transparency and the private sector. If we include the NDCs, we could say that this is within corporate sector, but there's no company sitting here. We actually have 4 key roles that are represented here because we wanted to see from a different perspective. We wanted to see how we are moving forward when it comes to transparency. And we should not forget the demand from the science on the governmental climate change panel on how we're allocating ourselves, what's the climate scenario for us, and also how close or how far we are of committing with our commitment in the Paris Agreement. We know that it has been 10 years from this Paris Agreement. We're going to be discussing the global balance because this highlights the need of accelerating efforts, improving our actions, joining efforts when it comes to transparency. We need to see this as a cross-sectional core that could help us to take decisions, manage regulatory framework, and perform such action. And looking at this in a cross-sectional way, this needs to be tied to all climate implementations. How are we accessing and transferring technology and the mechanisms and strategy for financing, reporting the data of emissions that are being held, and actions and commitments that each country is committed to. We have representation from the sector. We have representation from the companies supporting the gas and oil sector. We have Lineo within the program of the UN, the UNEP as part of the system, and also representing the multinational cooperation and the Mexican Observatory of Methane Emissions. This is actually one of the initiatives that are a landmark in the region in order to observe and track regulatory frameworks associated to methane, not only from the energetic sector, but also to see what do we need. So I would like to thank the 4 of you for sitting here with us, and I would like to start asking in an orderly fashion. I would like to ask Irene from the work that you have been doing with the different companies that you mentioned before. What are the main challenges that companies are facing in order to comply with international standards when it comes to transparency, and how is this being managed? Thank you, Alejandra. I would like to formally thank OLADE for inviting me. This gives me an opportunity to support the observatory from the institution standpoint, and the strategy from the oil and gas sector actually includes several challenges from a structural point of view, technical and regulatory framework in order to comply with the transparency indicators, particularly related to methane emissions and greenhouse emissions. From our organization, we have had more than 60 years in the market. We have been leading actions to help our associates to face these and many other challenges related to climate change. Mainly, we promote cooperation, the adoption of better practices, the use of innovative technologies in the workstations of our associates. We share lessons learned, and the importance of doing this is high. We have a commitment that we have kept throughout the years, and our sector is responsible for 15% of methane emissions in the region. Initiatives like the ones we had in Arpel with our workshops, forums, articles. What we are trying to do is to minimize these emissions, and we want to manage inventories and repairing and try to avoid any type of leaks. We want to assist our companies in order to face climate change. Going back to Alejandra's question, within the challenges that are the most relevant, I would like to highlight four. One would be institutional fragmentation that we have. There's lots of initiatives that are new and they are making progress, but we still have a lack of regulatory frameworks that could be homogeneous within the countries. This was mentioned earlier in the morning, but it's important to find or to get homogeneous aspects. And this was mentioned in the morning, that we needed to manage this in a suitable way. We still have challenges when it comes to coordination within the Ministry of Energy, Environmental and Mining Ministry. So we would say that this generates lots of difficulties. The second challenge that I would like to highlight is limitation on monitoring these emissions. There's lots of operational companies that are working on improving their inventories. There are many operators that do not have robust indicators on monitoring, report, and verification. The technologies for methane detection are not formally introduced, and there's gaps on traceability of emissions in the value chain. The third challenge would be the limited access to climate finance, and this is something that was mentioned before. We have a shortage of economic incentives to invest in cleaner technology, and there's some difficulties to access international financing. We're talking about relevant interventions. And the final challenge that I would like to highlight would be the regulatory framework coming from the international side. We are developing international standards in different regions from the world in order to promote transparency, traceability, accountability of risks related to climate change. And we have a risk that goes beyond the environment, because we're having a risk of commercial exclusion from business. We need to monetize the resource with these limits, for example, including standards of CBAM and others in Europe. the companies need to show compliance with standards, with due diligence when it comes to the climate. And I would like to highlight that from ARPEL, we are developing a project as a group with the IRM to develop capabilities and knowledge when it comes to manage risks and transition risks associated to the climate. We want to identify opportunities. The objective is that our companies could prepare for those regulatory frameworks, and we want to generate tools that could orient them and facilitate integration on managing risk in the strategy of each company. Thank you, Irene, and I would like to continue with somebody in the corner, which would be Erica. Erica, I don't know if maybe you could talk a little bit about the initiative of the observatory. Erica it's part of the initiative that she's going to discuss further on, and maybe you could discuss from the transparency standpoint what we could discuss on emissions. Thank you, everyone. I would like to join to the thanks that were already provided and it's important to strengthen alliances. And I believe I would like to comment that the Mexican Observatory of methane emissions was an initiative from the civil society in order to encourage compliance when it comes to methane regulation in the oil and gas sector. I am from Mexico. This is an initiative from Mexico. In Mexico, we had two different regulations that were particular from oil and gas sector when it comes to methane. One is related to taking advantage of natural gas, related to taking advantage at 98%, and the other one was a program for all the companies in this sector for them to have prevention, mitigation of methane, as well as preventing leaks in their chains of value. And as technical analysis of actions that we could take in this sector, we notice this was mentioned in other talks as well. We noticed that it was cost effective. That means that these actions could implement this. These companies could implement this, and this could be effective. And that's the reason of our observatory. We have 4 institutions of the civil society, and we have been doing this surveillance. From the civil society, we consider that from the OGME perspective, in order to have transparency, we could do monitoring on compliance, discussing transparency, and this is something that we have discussed. Providing information, it's important because sometimes in Mexico we were not considering how many key actors needed to comply with this. We have included which key actors need to comply this and if they are complying or not. Furthermore, we are not only thinking about showing data, but making data accessible. We could find information outside or certain data on methane, but for the general public or many key actors, is not necessarily something that they can access, or maybe they don't know what they mean. So I believe that from the civil society, we could contribute with a way of having a data translation. And this would help us to have a credibility or a more robust credibility of data, because sometimes people tell you okay, the data is there, but who would be the third or the third party that would check the data and that the data is suitable? The civil society, I believe it could be the third eye, you would say, or that would verify that. We could exchange information, methodology, and we want to be a bridge between the private companies or international entities and other key actors in order to contribute to transparency. I don't want to talk too much. Yes, Erica. Now, Florencia. Yes, I would like to mention or take the advantage from OLADE and the observatory as well. I want to thank Lineo as well. And sometimes we need, I will have to say that we need hands in the exercise of climate change in order to speed up the effort among all of us and to achieve this purpose. I would like to say, Florencia, maybe I know that we have seen companies that are related to diverse initiatives within the observatory. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about the detail and what would be the support that international agencies are providing to close those gaps when it comes to monitoring, reporting, and verification in the countries and in the region as well. Thank you, Alejandra. And I would like to thank OLADE for inviting me. And thank you for reminding Manfredi as well, because once you mentioned it, and I was thinking about the fact that we were there with him in the first summit, but thank you for that. Before starting, I wanted to highlight the words that Garzón mentioned in some of its interactions, because he said he talked about two words, which is the summit or the summary of everything that we have discussing, which is data and transparency. These are the pillars that are fundamental to develop regulations and policies that will be efficient. And I'm going to give you two clear examples on how to have data that could be imprecise and how could that lead you to jeopardize your risks. One example from Argentina could be that what happened to me, and I was doing a research on the four bi-yearly report, and this was based on the inventory from 2018, and the other report was based on 2020. If you analyze the energetic sector and what it represents regarding methane emissions, you could notice that there is a serious leap and difference between what one report could be compared to the other. One represents 1.2% of methane emissions on third position after agricultural and waste. In the fifth report, it represents 19% of emissions, being in the second position after the agricultural sector. So what are the baseline of our reports to understand the opportunities of mitigation? Because between 2018 and 2020, there was not an increase in production. Once you start building regulations, you need to consider where are your efforts going to go. And this is an example that, for me, it's quite interesting. We need to understand where are we getting our data from. The second one is an example from Mexico, to quote a study. I always mention this case, but I think that this is happening elsewhere in the world. If you go and measure with the suitable technology, you start thinking about top-down or conciliation with the bottom-up remarks, measuring on-site as well with technology that could do the conciliation of data. So this, what it provides, it's an integral comprehension of the emission sources and the magnitude. In Mexico, when we're talking about this scientific study, we found that there was a huge discrepancy between the offshore and onshore emissions. The result was that the offshore emissions were overvalued and the onshore were underestimated. So the reality was opposite to what was estimated in our inventory, and we were basing our policies. We were setting resources and policies in places where we did not need to. So having data which is accurate and based in science would help us determine the opportunities and focus our resources when we need to allocate them to, and focus on the Paris Agreement as well in the speed and the scale that we need to. So that's the objective from the Observatory of Methane Emissions, to provide data based on science that could be transparent and accessible for those who have the power of acting and reducing such emissions. Now I'm going to focus on the private sector because many things have arisen, but I would like to mention that all the initiatives of INEO are cross-sectional, and we need to close the gaps that we have in order to have data of quality. And we need to consider that we have a system that notifies these gas emissions to all the government of the world. We have scientific studies that are performing several campaigns throughout the world, not only on oil and gas, and also other sources. Also in Colombia, we're doing a baseline study. In Argentina, we have measured the abandoned wells. And we also consider the Ocean P 2.0, which is the alliance of the private sector against methane emissions. This is the only reporting framework based on measurements from the oil and gas sector. This alliance help us to stop considering generic factors in order to measure or to be based on measurements. This promotes the interaction of companies, and it is based on two fundamental pillars: transparency and science. The community of practice, as mentioned, it's also helping because we are exchanging good practices from companies. We held a yearly conference, we do webinars, we accelerate the learning of each company. OEMP was formed in year 2020 with 62 members, and now we have doubled our members. We have more than 153 companies along the world, and we cover the three segments of production: upstream, mainstream, and downstream. OHMP is actually covering 40% of oil and gas production. And in Latin America, we're covering 61% of upstream, considering 50% of operational assets and unoperated assets on the 50%. We were talking about OSMP levels, level 5, level 3, level 2, but I think that it is important to clarify what's the definition of the levels. We need to understand how this regulatory framework would help each company to progress on data that could be unprecise, that could be based on generic data. And just to mention this quite quickly, level 1 is based on quantification in an active level with generic indicators. Second level are 5 categories of emission sources by using generic emission sources. Third level includes particular sources, but we're still using generics. And the fourth would include measurements at the source. And I believe that we could have a factor of emission that could be specific to that source, but based on measurement. And level 5 would be on-site measurements. We're talking about the ones that could embody the total of emissions in a region. We're talking air freight, drones, sensors in vehicles. So that conciliation of data at a level 5 in a site or coming from a source will give you a holistic approach of your emission, and this would help the companies to find sources that maybe they were not considering before, allocating resources for opportunities of mitigation and cost-effective measures. I would like to mention again, and I would like to highlight this, that Ecopetrol is part of the first group of companies that last year achieved gold standard. What is this? Well, when a company reaches level 5 within their 3 years for their operated assets, that would be that. And we have 5 years to reach level 5, and Sierra Gold was also highlighted in the report because they introduced an implementation plan that was excellent with regards to how they want to reach that level of reporting. And to finish, and then I would end my comment, I want to highlight the OHMP results. From the yearly report, we can highlight that 83% of emissions are coming from upstream, and emission sources, first of all, are venting, fugitive emissions, and third, we have incomplete combustion as a result of inefficiency in the quality of burning. With that, I would end my comment. Thank you.
So moving along with the same question for Hillmert in this case. Hillmert, if you can tell us what Tachyus works on, and also as a solutions company, precisely what support do you offer to close these existing gaps with regards to monitoring, reporting, and verification? Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation, Alejandra and all the OLADE team. Well, Tachyus is a company that offers digital solutions for emissions management for companies in the energy sector and other emission-intensive sectors. We are focused on all greenhouse gases. However, we have a peculiarity on methane as one of the most important gases, and that we mainly need to tackle in the remainder of this decade. To summarize, our support provided to users is with management or simplification of information, and we've seen we have 4 major challenges that users or clients, well, the companies, have in building their inventories. The first is data quality. Often, the user has no proper emissions management. It will depend that we have adequate data at a proper level of detail that first allows us to determine what are emissions at every site or level of the organization, with the goal to take corresponding measurements. So as part of this practice that we carry out, we support clients in organizing that data and in including proper emissions model for the corresponding calculation. In that sense, I would highlight materiality, which is one of the major challenges that companies currently have. Often, knowledge is required on how facilities operate and which of these facilities truly have emissions and what is the emissions mechanism. As often, we have methane only limited to leaks and venting, but actually, for example, incomplete combustion or low efficiency combustion is a source that may be significant for methane, and it must be considered throughout the strategy for reducing methane emissions. In addition to that, we also have challenges in the transition that currently companies are undertaking with models, as Florencia mentioned, from Tier 1 and Tier 2 into models that are more specific based on emissions. In Latin America, there are already many countries that are including these regulations in order to improve the quality of their emissions. So, that transition is very important to undertake it, and it is one of the major challenges that companies currently have, especially in the oil and gas sector. And in this case, also, in order to try to employ less the factors that are published in literature, which actually belong to studies in the United States and other latitudes that have a completely different configuration. And finally, the other support that we have seen has been needed or challenge is to link the operation with emissions management. These are two areas that are symbiotic. They are linked one and the other, and in that sense, an operations plan must be the beginning for an emissions forecast and for establishing goals. In that sense, we have to always look at the projection I have for the future of the asset. What are the expansion plans and the projects for reducing emissions? And what are the many alternatives that we have in the future of the asset in order to lead to an adequate decarbonization plan, and based on that to support the goals and to see what else we need to fulfill the goals, or whether the plan that we have for the future of the facility is sufficient. So that's a brief summary of this field of action. Great, thank you so much, Hillmert. So resuming here with Irene, and we will have a second round of questions, and then we will move on to the break. I would like to ask you, what concrete progress have you achieved from ARPEL and organizations that are associated there in the implementation of these systems for monitoring and reporting? Thank you, Alejandra. And I like this question more. It is more positive. I like to wrap up with a more positive message. Actually, there are many advancements, particularly ourselves from the year 2021. We ran a survey and research on the level of maturity in methane emissions management in our partners. And here I mean ARPEL's partner operating companies in that year. And this year we repeated it exactly the same. And the preliminary results, because we are still some responses away, but we are at 75% progress. They are quite encouraging, very encouraging. Specifically, if we compare LiDAR programs back then, here we mean detection and leak repair operations, we note an increase of more than 50% of companies that already have these programs, 100% implemented throughout the value chain of the company. If we go to the inventory analysis for methane emissions, the outcomes are even more encouraging, given that it quadrupled the percentage of companies with level 3 inventories. And here I mean levels according to IPCC. We are saying that levels 1 and 2 are based on estimations, based on emissions factors. The level 3 is already a level of inventory where it's based on direct mentions. Direct emissions. And then we have 4% more level of company that for companies that already have inventories that are specific to methane, which leaves us very happy, actually. And in these 4 years, the number of companies that already have corporate goals that are specific to cut back on methane and which are currently enforcing concrete methane reduction measures. We even have many companies that have already publicly expressed their willingness and commitment in mitigating methane emissions by having signed some of the many existing initiatives internationally for reducing emissions. And one example here, since I have Florencia, I would like to highlight that we already have 7 of our partner companies that are adhered to the OCNP Alliance 2.0. These are Chevron, Ecopetrol, NGC in Trinidad and Tobago, Petrobras, Epepetro Ecuador, Shell, and Tableau. So, in addition to that, from Arpel, we provide institutional support to the observatory from OLADE, and we believe it will contribute much with data standardization and criteria at the regional level. We know that there is much still to go, but from Arpel, we are fully committed to continue pushing and supporting our partners in this journey. Thank you so much, Irene. And coming back to Erika, I would like to ask you, from the experience you've had with the observatory, how can alliances among professional associations, companies, governments, and cooperation accelerate this process to improve and guarantee greater transparency every time? I believe a very important part is precisely, and it's been mentioned here as well, and this is standardization of processes, of MRB processes. So I believe there are many levels that one can start with, but that helps precisely transparency to see that data is reliable. But, and from civil society, I would like to emphasize that it can also be an opportunity to align it to these international commitments on methane mitigation as a way to also standardize these methodologies. And that also allows to include other matters that I believe are important, such as climate justice. And that is including different actors throughout this chain, and also making proposals or working jointly on different governance structures. I believe that can be one opportunity that we have in strengthening alliances. Another matter is also precisely the momentum from coordinated regulatory frameworks. How, based on having this homogeneity in these mechanisms, I believe we can lead it to the level of regulatory frameworks where we are failing, what is it that is not making possible to standardize or to report data adequately, properly. So from the observatory, we obtain data via requests for information that we issue, and from around 365 companies, precisely for the issue of these methane emissions control programs that we unveiled, or at least based on this information, we unveiled that only 37% was delivering it. So from the observatory, this is beginning to work also on why is that not happening. And often it is due to the forms that need to be filled out are not accessible, they cannot be standardized, or they cannot be filled out because they don't know how to. There are no such trainings, but also from the institutional end, the fact that often they have no capability to process these reports. And I believe there, alliances with many, both international bodies, the private sector, civil society, we can build these work groups where we can all sit down to get working on these specific points. In addition to that, I also believe that this is pushing adoption for these international pledges and how we can fulfill them. So in that sense, I believe that collaborations and alliances are very important. And just to finish, from civil society, we can also be like the arm, or at least the experience of the open, to exert pressure for complying to these commitments, not only in the actors that are regulated, but also from the end of those that need to issue the regulations of these mechanisms in order to be able to fulfill these commitments. Let me know. We have little time, so Florencia, concretely tell us what is coming with the initiatives or each of these windows that you were mentioning related to email and some specific concrete progress in that activity here in the region. I will try to summarize as I have much progress to tell about, and I want to be brief. I will attempt it, but basically I would like to mention two things, trying to be brief. The reporting standard of OSMP is being used more every time, not only by the private sector, but also in regulations, because it is understood that it is interesting to speak in a single language. When, for instance, in the countries of our region, reporting standards are being created instead of creating new standards and starting to think how the level of reporting can be, but simply reutilizing one that already operates, provides credibility. And that is something that countries and provinces in the region begin to want to incorporate in their regulations, considering that the European regulation, which was published last year, that regulates methane emissions coming from the oil and gas sector and also coal, it included the reporting standard from OSMP, or in its section 12, which is basically the component for monitoring, reporting, and verification of the regulation. It is based on the OSMP standards. That would apply for local producers. What's interesting in this regulation, which eventually can get to have implications for us and Latin American countries, eventually those who want to become exporters to the European Union, there is a specific chapter for energy importers where, based on starting the year 2027, it will demand equivalence of MRV, which is basically based on section 12, which is OSMP level 5, plus verification by an independent third party. It is not mandatory, clearly, to be an OSMP member. The equivalence can be achieved in two ways, or to fulfill Article 12, which is basically this data reconciliation, or the company, in being OSMP member, have a major stretch already advanced, but they should have verification from an independent third party. That applies for those contracts signed in 2024. Eventually, there will be modifications to those contracts. Not only the European Union, but buyers such as Japan and South Korea, via the Clean Initiative, they have highlighted in their initiative the Ocean Peace Standard as a standard of quality in reporting. And I understand there's an ISO that's being developed that will also be based on this standard. As mentioned before, currently civil society and consumers, financial entities are giving recent and growing importance to the transparency and mitigation of emissions, and this standard, what it gives financial entities is a performance indicator. Eventually, what has happened with the countries of our region based on the European regulation is that we have received many expressions of interest and requests for support to align regulations to the standard, always understanding that it's worthwhile speaking in the same language when we are discussing reporting. And the second thing I wanted to mention is how we're standing. Before moving on to that, I would like to say that starting from this support requirement by countries in Latin America and other countries in the region, what we are planning to publish, and this is a news break, if I could say, this is a support guide for those countries that are seeking to align merely the component of monitoring, reporting, and verification of their regulation with Ocean P reporting standards, and always understanding that there's an aim for this to have alignment with European Union standards, because basically they would be applicable to those countries that want to export. That's on one end. And second, what I wanted to say is on this progress that we had through the Mars system in the reduction of methane emissions. And basically, I would like to mention Latin America because thanks to these alliances that we have made with governments, which have designated focal points to receive notifications from Mars, responses at 100% have been achieved in Argentina, where we have many focal points in different provinces. There is one new case of successful mitigation in Argentina in the province of Chubut. Today, a news piece was published at the UNEP page that is performing an update of 7 successful mitigation cases that happened around the world thanks to the Mars implementation system. And simply to briefly tell you how the Mars system works, when it detects and attributes a major emission to a specific facility based on a combination where eventually Mars uses 12 satellites, that mission is notified to the focal point designated by the government. If the company is a member of OHMP, they are automatically notified. Otherwise, the focal point of government is asked to pass the notification to the operator. After that pass of notification, what is expected is to receive a response. In other words, the operator should inform on the causes that gave rise to that event, what was the quantification, and everything that they want to report to us will serve to understand what really happened. And if it is reported that there was mitigation, what is done is to prove with satellites that that emission, once detected, it is no longer detected by the satellites passing over that region. Only when that situation is reached, that case can be categorized as a proven mitigation case. Beyond the 7 mitigation cases published today, it is important to mention that there are cases that we cannot categorize as mitigation because there is no real mitigation occurring, but the information that government arrives on satellite data, this is information that often governments cannot access or that they do not have, and that is something that we are very thankful to, because thanks to that we can understand where emission sources are at and where inspections need to be focused on. So that's somewhat on progress from the observatory on the lines of Mars and Ocean P. Perfect. Thank you so much, Florencia. And lastly, Hilbert, please tell us about an experience that from Tachyus you have supported these MRV institutions and what lessons learned are there? What experience you've had in that? I have many examples to give. In general, to be brief, the support we have provided to all of these companies, both in Latin America and the United States, we have harmonization of this data with field emissions. Quite often we have some measurements that are performed outside of the standards required for EPA reporting, for example, or from other standards, but that give us some idea on a situation that is ongoing. An example is an undetected venting or an undetected leak that could be detected, for example, via satellite, but it has no explanation if we consider leak detection systems. So in that sense, our system has supported those companies to detect those situations, to perform the necessary inspections, and to give solution to those discrepancies. Often those discrepancies have no solution from the perspective of quantification, given the gap that always exists between quantification or quantification modes and the operational reality. But in many of those cases, we have achieved harmonizing both scenarios. That per se is a success story where we have supported companies. Thank you so much, Hillmert. And so with this last question, we would deem our transparency panel closed. I would like to thank the 4 of you for having been with us in the space. And we now invite you all to move out to the hall for our coffee break. Thank you.